I'm Paul Resnikoff at Digital Music News. We've had the pleasure of sort of moderating this Global Creators Summit, hopefully digging into a lot of these media issues. I don't think we can do it as well as noted author of many publications, magazines, articles, Rob Levine, who is going to be interviewing a panel of experts on this topic. So without further ado, Rob.
Thank you.
Sure.
So today, as Paul said, we have a panel on the value gap. We're going to start with a presentation by Graham Henderson, the President and CEO of Music Canada, and then we're going to turn it over to a panel with some various different perspectives. Before that, I will introduce Graham Henderson, President and CEO of Music Canada, who's going to sort of explain this issue, the origins of the problem, and where it might go from here. Graham?
Thanks, Rob. Okay. So back in the year 2003, a famous recording artist, Canadian, was asked about his prospects in the new digital economy on the radio. I heard it sitting on the Gardner. What his response was, what his prospects were, he said, "We're entering a golden age." This idea came to be embraced by artists, policymakers, the media, and many, many others worldwide. At the time, peer-to-peer file sharing had become the default way for people to access virtually unlimited content online, and it was done for free. There was a widespread belief that the digital era would usher in a utopia for both musicians and consumers. Now, in return for the collapse of their traditional marketplace, artists were told that they would make more money from concerts, merchandise, and other means. In hindsight, we should have cast a more skeptical eye to these predictions. For today, artists struggle more than ever to earn a living, and the creative middle class, as it was, has virtually ceased to exist. They work longer hours for scandalously less money. Author, composer, and virtual reality pioneer Jaron Lanier recently concluded, and I quote, "We have seen an implosion of career opportunities for those who have devoted their lives to cultural expression." And here in Canada, our creators, the people who have built our nation's cultural foundation and much of the intellectual property that we export, they're struggling, along with the people and businesses who support them. Just as youth today are told they must accept a world of precarious employment, the gutting of the creative class for over the past 2 decades has been presented as an inevitability. And it's time that we question this supposition. We must resist the idea that we cannot change the circumstances in which we live. This is an outlet that is founded on a sort of hyper-capitalist technological determinism in which the market rules all and governments need to get out of the way. Just a week ago, The Guardian published an article on this subject and pointed at Ayn Rand as the foundation of this. And the foundation of Ayn Rand's theories are an outright contempt for the state. And today's Randians are in power in the United States. Trump cites her as the foundation as his favorite, the Fountainhead as his favorite book. Tillerson, Paul Ryan. But also, Ayn Rand is the foundation of the princes of Silicon Valley. Why? It caters to a sort of a single-minded vision. The idea that you don't have to ask for permission, you pursue a personal vision regardless of the outcome. But we have to remember that we live in a social democracy, a place where people, not corporations, not plutocrats, get to decide how to order their lives. We have to be able to see the world as it might and should be. It was people, not corporations, who gave Canada universal health care because people decided that that was the way they wanted to live their lives. We inherited this great tradition, and we can deploy it to restore the balance. To map out a solution, we should first consider, though, how the creative community got where it got to today. So the foundation for most of the rules and regulations which govern our modern digital environment are the 1996 World Intellectual Property Organization Internet Treaties. At the time those treaties were adopted, in 1996, less than 1% of the world's population was online. It was 2.5 years before Napster appeared, 4.5 years before the iPod, 8 years before YouTube, and a decade before Spotify. The people who set those rules in 1996 were well-intentioned, but in reality, they were guessing. And it's been 20 years since those early WIPO guesses, so how are we doing? Well, according to WIPO's stated goals, the treaties would, and I quote, emphasize the outstanding significance of copyright protection as an incentive for literary and artistic creation. And it would, quote, recognize the need to maintain a balance between the rights of authors and the larger public interest. Now, these are laudable goals, but everything was going to come down to finding the correct balance that would supercharge a digital economy, a digital marketplace, for the benefit both of creators and the public. Technology advocates and so-called intermediaries argued that in order for the new technological infrastructure to get off the ground, creators would have to give up, forego, copyright payments that would otherwise have been required before the copyright rules were introduced. This was implemented in copyright laws worldwide by granting them safe harbors from liability and exceptions to royalties they would otherwise have had to pay. According to this quid pro quo, creators would be better off by gaining access to larger, more diverse marketplace. This was the promise of the golden age. It was a bargain. It was a social contract, and it was one that very quickly turned Faustian. Economist Olivier Bombsell characterized the new arrangement as a massive system of cross-subsidies. By foregoing money otherwise payable to them, the creative community would subsidize the technological infrastructure development. Well, if there is a golden age, it has eluded a new generation of musicians. In 2011, the average artist in Canada made just $7,200 from music-related activity. According to a 2013 study, this was far short of a living wage. More than 80% of writers in Canada earn income from their writing that is below the poverty line, and that's just outrageous. Creators are not alone in their struggle to stay afloat in the new economy. The English economist Guy Standing argues that technologies are disrupting the way in which income and earnings are distributed. He describes the appearance of a gap between the increasing growth and concentration of profits and the decline and increasing uncertainty of wages, giving rise to a new social class that we all now know as the precariat. Creators, I would argue, are the precariat's charter members. Musicians are struggling at a time when music is generating fabulous amounts of money. It's just that very little of it seems to be getting to them. Now, part of the problem has to do with the growing popularity of online subscription and ad-supported music streaming services. Ad-supported services like YouTube and SoundCloud have driven most of the increase in digital music consumption while delivering far less revenue than paid services. A subscription service, Spotify, for example, returned $18 a year per consumer, $18 a year per consumer in 2014 compared to YouTube's $1. Ad-supported services like YouTube, with more than 13 times more users than paid services, have delivered less than 1/3 of the royalties. The resulting disparity between digital music revenues earned by the music community and the growing consumption has been dubbed the value gap. In 2016 and 2017, both Europe and the US, in Europe and the US, thousands of artists have petitioned their government to address this gap and rebalance the rules. In Canada, more than 2,600 creators have issued a similar call in a letter to Heritage Minister Melanie Joly. The letter, submitted jointly by Music Canada, Canadian Independent Music Association, SOCAN, the Canadian Country Music Association, the Writers' Union of Canada, the Playwrights Guild of Canada, and other stakeholders, expresses the hope that Minister Joly recognizes the value and crucial place of creators' work in the Canadian economy and asks that she put creators at the heart of future policy making. The assembly of so many creators from so many fields around a single idea, which is a call to rebalance the playing field so that creators continue to build on Canada's great cultural legacy, well, that's nothing less than extraordinary. With one voice, they have announced their concern that too many creators are being squeezed out of the marketplace, that while Canada's creative professionals have led Canada in the digital shift, they struggle to earn a livelihood from it. Many artists have shared that letter online, adding their own experiences. For example, Juno-nominated Ottawa musician Kathleen Edwards posted this to her Facebook page. Fellow Canadian musicians and creators, read this letter and tell me it doesn't ring true. Every company from Spotify to Rogers and Bell Media enjoys the benefit of an outdated copyright law that fundamentally doesn't appropriately compensate the creators of the content they use to make money. She went on, sign this letter. I did. If you know people in the creative arts in Canada, share it. It's important that Canadians know and appreciate that artists contribute to the economy in this country and that their intellectual property deserves to be protected. This isn't a please give us a handout letter. It's a please implement policy that protects us letter. Now, we know that our government is listening. Last month, following the Canadian Content in a Digital World consultations, Minister Joly said publicly that what she had heard loud and clear was, quote, the fact that creators should be at the center of our future policy, that we should address the issue of fairness to creators when it comes to how they can make a living in this digital age, closed quote. So now we're waiting. What are they going to do? Well, if you will allow me, I'll turn now to some things that the government should consider doing. Any approach to the problem facing Canada's creators needs to be holistic and multi-jurisdictional at the local, provincial, and federal levels. Music Canada, for example, identified local policy options to improve the business environment for creators and creative businesses in 2015, in its 2015 Music Cities report. A growing number of municipalities are discovering the job creation, economic growth, cultural growth, and other opportunities that music can generate. And as many of you know, there is a full-day Music City Summit that is happening in this hotel as I speak, and it's bringing global city planners and their music and the music industry together. At the provincial level, Ontario and British Columbia have created substantial music funds and music-friendly policies, such as strategies to facilitate live music performances. Now, for her part, Minister Joly has asked people across the country to think big, to be ambitious, and to step outside the box. The government has made it clear that it wants a new toolkit, those are her words, to confront the challenges facing Canada's creators when it seeks to create a new social contract. Well, here are some thoughts about how our government might apply the 4 levers that are available to it. The government can legislate, it has program funding, it has policies and treaties, and it has institutions. Those are the levers. So let's take them one by one. Legislation. Simply put, the Government of Canada needs to end all of the cross-subsidies paid by creators to digital and traditional broadcast businesses, many of which now are unimaginably wealthy. The goal was initially to get those businesses off the ground. Job done. Policies and treaties. Following the example of provincial and municipal policies that are designed to attract foreign direct investment into the domestic music economy, the federal government could also pitch in with supportive policies of its own. In addition, it could promote Canada as the brilliant music tourism destination that we are. Both of these levers, legislation and policies, are ultimately the focus of the Creator's letter to Minister Joly. In the words of that letter, Canada has 2 major opportunities to stand up for creators over the next year: your department's ongoing cultural policy review and the 5-year mandated review of the Copyright Act, which is slated to start in November of this year. Turning now to the 3rd lever, program funding. Obviously, we need to keep Canada's enviable system of music program funding in line with inflation and changing marketplace realities. I was therefore very pleased to see Minister Joly announce an investment of $4.15 million in export funding to promote Canadian artists around the world. Other solutions could include alleviating the dire housing affordability situation facing artists via infrastructure spending and developing skills and entrepreneurial training programs for artists. Institutions. The federal government has already taken positive steps to increase funding for the CBC and the Canadian Council for the Arts. Next, it should modernize the Copyright Board of Canada and turn it into a true business development office for the creative industries. Just this past December, the Standing Senate Committee on Banking, Trade, and Commerce released a report, and it was called The Copyright Board, a Rationale for Urgent Review. The report stated that the Copyright Board of Canada plays a pivotal role, and it does, in Canada's cultural sector. Yet from what the committee heard, the board is, and I'm quoting, dated, dysfunctional, and in dire need of reform. Now, in keeping with Minister Joly's aspiration to go in new and bigger directions, I think the government should look at funding music education to help make up for growing shortfalls that have put music programs across the country, particularly for inner city youth, remote and rural and Indigenous communities, in jeopardy. For that matter, the liberal arts in general are at risk. The federal government needs to exercise a leadership role in reconnecting our young people with the importance of a liberal arts education and with the importance of creativity. You know, John Adams, when he visited France in 1780, wrote home saying that, and I'm not going to get the quote right, but his point was, he said, I need to study politics and such so that my son will be able to study, and then he listed off a series of technical studies, like that they would study mathematics and so on and so forth. But they would study that, science and technology and engineering and math, that his children would study that so that their children could study the arts. And I think that aspiration is breaking down, and that the liberal arts are suffering an across-the-board degradation. Rebuilding respect for the humanities is a nationally important issue. Now, the other thing that Minister Joly has asked, and I find it quite interesting, is how can the government use content to promote a stronger democracy. And I think it's something that we're all quite concerned about these days. In searching for a response, I think that we must consider that to the extent that we allow voices of our creators to be compromised or marginalized, our democracy will suffer a great loss. Think, for example, of the essential role played throughout history by poets, musicians, filmmakers, and novelists in the fight for democracy and civil rights. Young people today, creators, and other members of the precariat are objecting to the difficult circumstances that they face, just as people fought against the brutalities of the first industrial revolution. In a social democracy, we do not have to just get used to it, which is what we're being told by a lot of government folks. We have the right to decide what sort of a world we live in. And this got me thinking about the intimate connection throughout history between creators and democracy. And I'm going to end on this thought. They've always played an essential role in the fight for democracy and civil rights. And here in Canada, we've got an immediate example to hand, Gord Downey's The Secret Path. But to his voice and his name, we could add Pete Seeger, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and many, many more. These are all people who were banned, exiled, jailed, or worse, for their fight for justice and democratic principles. And I think it's instructive that after the revolution in Czechoslovakia, the people turned not to a strongman or an authoritarian, but to a playwright. That playwright dubbed his revolution the Velvet Revolution because it was powered by illicit cassette tapes of Lou Reed's band, The Velvet Underground. Creators are truly, as Percy Shelley famously said, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, when he says they're legislators, he does not mean they're lawyers. He doesn't necessarily mean they're politicians. What I think he's saying is that creators predict our future, they underpin our future, and they create a framework, political and cultural, for our future. To the extent that we allow voices like that to be compromised or marginalized, our democracy suffers a great loss. Should we get used to the way things are? Well, some of our politicians and virtually the entire techno-utopian community says yes. But why should we get used to this? The citizens who opposed the brutal child labor regimes of the first industrial revolution did not get used to that. They fought to change them, and they did change them. And they changed the world for the better. And we're in the midst of what some are calling the fourth industrial revolution now. And while it has ushered in great boons, it has also ushered in great banes. Mary and Percy Shelley fully understood this when they wrote Frankenstein. They understood that the unmediated introduction of new technology into society can create monsters. But it does not need to. Not if technology is accountable to the people, to all people. So my answer to the minister's question about democracy is this. If you want a stronger democracy that is less vulnerable to special interests, that distributes wealth equitably, then do everything in your power to restore balance to the world in which our creators live. Encourage them, enable them. They are not living in a golden age. That was the promise, but they didn't get it. The promise was broken, and we owe it to them, and we owe it to them now. And we would do well to remember that the fight for democracy and justice has always had a soundtrack. Thank you.
What I love about hearing Graham speak is that you get so much more than the average sort of music perspective. You get a perspective on music and you know, literature and politics and the Shelleys. It's a lot more than you probably weren't coming to Music Canada expecting quite all that intellectual content, but it's sort of, it helps put this in perspective. I want to introduce the panel. Graham Henderson, you heard from. Susan Combo, the CEO of Lagam, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce what it stands for, but you can.
Perfect.
Sure.
Nice music.
Okay. And we have Eddie Schwartz, who's the chair of Music Creators North America, and Neville Quinlan, the managing director of Pure Music, who's also on the board of directors of the Canadian Music Publishers Association. Just to sort of start things off, I thought what you said was interesting, because, you know, I thought we were on the third industrial revolution. I wasn't aware we were on 4 already. But, you know, there are, like, in one way, this is an argument about who makes money on the enormous amount of value being generated by music online, but it's also an argument about what kind of society we want to live in. We see echoes of this in Uber and Airbnb. A lot of these companies, you could argue, are in some ways cross-subsidized. Whether you like Uber or taxi cabs, it seems reasonable that they're regulated the same way. You see all kinds of these things. So just to sort of start things off, how do you sort of, when you talk about this to policymakers, even to musicians, to songwriters, how do you frame this issue? Because it's a small issue in some ways, and in other ways, it's something that we're really dealing with all over the place.
Well, actually, I think, thanks, Robert, I think that's really a perceptive question, because I think it's actually a massive issue. In fact, I think the zeitgeist of our time is, as Graham pointed out, the deterioration of the middle class. And I think songwriters and music creators are just one of many classes, as you pointed out, of people who are suffering from, it's kind of a Bernie Sanders argument that we have an enormous extraction of value, which is another phrase I've heard from some of our European friends and colleagues when they're discussing this. So much value is being extracted by technology companies that those of us in the creative space are really fighting over the crumbs that fall off the table. So you can never get to fair valuation. But the important thing is, and it comes back to something else you said, Graham, the reason that Donald Trump is the president of the United States is because of this issue. It's because of the collapse of the middle class. People were desperate. He sold them a bill of goods about he's going to make America great again. So we are just part of the zeitgeist of our times, where middle class incomes have collapsed, and people are looking to extremists, basically, to find some solution. And I think we all know how that's going to
We've been calling this the Orange Revolution in the U.S.
The Orange Revolution? Because
not really.
Yeah. No, I get it. So I think, so I'm just going to say this and then I'll stop, but I think the more that we place ourselves in that broader zeitgeist that's leading to such incredible political instability, the farther we're going to get with politicians, because they get that. Yeah. They get that that's what's happening globally. So it's not just a Canadian, and I think, again, we have to think about this internationally. Google's an international company, Apple, the ISPs, the telcos. So we have to think bigger than the Canadian. Of course, in Canada, we have to work on our government regulation and legislation here in Canada, but I think we also have to join the international groups all over the world that are working on the same problem in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere.
Speaking of international, Suzanne, how does this seem in France? You know, one of the things you see in Europe is, how can I say this nicely? You know, the French have always had a rather love-hate relationship with large American companies. In this case, I tend to agree, but how is it perceived there? Because it's a bit different. You have La GAFA, I think it's called. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Explain what that is, because I'm not sure if people know it.
Okay, GAFA, it's Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. So this is the big companies, the global companies that exploit our works, the cultural contents, without paying it. So we call it GAFA, just to summarize a little bit the partner or the enemy, depends. And I just would like to say to you that I'm a singer-songwriter in France, so based in France, and I'm also vice president of the International Artist Organization, which has been created to advocate and to lobby. It's by artists, for artists, and it's about the value gap. It's about we are working at the European level with MEPs, and we are working on about the digital single market project, and on the copyright review, and it's a massive work. It's a massive work, and we are artists and creators. We are between so powerful companies, and they are they succeed in implement a new idea that everything is free, is for free, and it's all about the consumer, and it's all for the consumer. But we think as artists, we are also consumers, so we know how it could be more balanced. And we need just a more balanced market, so we can all stakeholders can enjoy the digital opportunity, because artists love technology and we need technology. It's a wonderful opportunity to have new tools, to be closer to our audience. So it's amazing, but it's not fair. It's not fair enough, it's not fair yet, and it's a pity, and we have to struggle all together. Publishers, recording labels, artists and creators have to be together to fight for the same balanced market, and the value gap has to be, it's very important to resolve these value gaps. There is many of them, but it's also important to be conscious that it has to benefit to every stakeholders. And we are very, we need more transparency first. We fight for more transparency, for a fair share of value, for a duty of care between each stakeholders. It's very important to have respect in business, in that kind of business which is very opaque. Now.
Let's talk about it. How has this changed? You know, I wrote a book called Free Ride. It came out in the fall of 2011. And when I suggested that safe harbors had driven down the value of music, you know, a lot of people thought I was on something. Not necessarily untrue. But later, you know, now, I'm joking. Later, you know, as the years have gone by, it's become a much more, you know, this idea has become more accepted. And more broadly, to go back to what I was saying before, the idea that these big companies are big companies, which once, you know, I know this sounds crazy, but in 2010, if you said, hey, Facebook is an aggressively for-profit driven entity, people looked at you like, the people who are sharing? That's all really changed. How did that happen, and what effects have that had? Because you see the popular view changing. You don't see that reflected in politics yet.
Well, I was just going to say something, because I think part of it, and the difference between, I think I'm sitting up here with three people representing sort of associations and organizations and large group, big thinking sort of associations, and I'm kind of one of the guys who's part of the problem. And I work for a company called Peer Music. I'm a publisher. It's not that I'm myopic, it's just that I have where I work is a smaller view than outside for when you take into account artists, labels, writers, everything. So what I think part of the problem is that we are a fractured industry. And so when we do approach things, like when we're negotiating with a YouTube, a Spotify, Apple, we're doing it, it's not an open negotiation. It's not like we're all sitting in a room together and hashing out something as a large body where we really speak with one voice and real force. Really what happens is, and can I tell a very fast analogy? And like where I sort of look at it is that I'm trying to grow the publisher's share of the pie just a little bit more. I'm trying to also grow the entire pie a little bit more. And I want to have more pies on the table. And this is Mike McCarty's here, and he told this story, which I think is really Mike McCarty from SOCAN now, but a publisher from EMI. He told the story is that most of the time, and as publishers, we sort of feel like we're all walking down the same road with the labels and the artists and everyone. But what happens is at some point, everything goes quiet, and no one's standing with us, and we're sort of walking, and then we come around a corner, and there are technology companies, major labels, indie labels, all that sort of thing, and they're all eating this large blueberry pie, and they're stuffing it in their faces. And we come around the corner, and all of a sudden they look up and they go, oh yeah, publishing. And then all of a sudden I'm negotiating and they say, oh, we've left a little bit for you here. And really what happens is that I'm trying to have this larger global view and trying to look at, whether it be safe harbor, whether it just be like the rates that we're getting from YouTube in particular, the free tier on Spotify, things that are real issues for us. And we're not even in the game, and yet we represent we represent an important part of the piece of the puzzle that these technology companies need in order to, have their companies.
I think it's fair to say that songwriters and artists haven't gotten much of the pie either, so certainly publishers aren't alone. But I just wanted to come back to your question, Robert. I've had the privilege of speaking around the world at various educational institutions and universities, and Google has done an incredible job, as other digital companies, of completely owning this intellectual debate and this whole question of what is free and everything's free. And you used a phrase, Graham, you said the creative class. Well, there are whole universities that are turning out the last generation and the next generation of attorneys who work on this stuff, who actually believe that the idea of a creative class is a horrible thing, is a terrible, terrible thing. So to answer your question, I mean, Google has a lot more money.
Can you unpack that a bit? Because I understand what you mean, but I'm not sure everybody does.
Well, so this idea that everything, I think that the wool has been pulled over our collective eyes. First of all, we're all addicted to our technology. That's very helpful. We all love it, including, as Suzanne said, those of us who make music. And Google has spent billions, I imagine, around the world controlling the discussion about what's cool, about that everything is free. All intellectual property wants to be free, and they've put tremendous resources on that we can't equal those kinds of resources. And I think it really dominated the conversation. And I think now people are it's kind of an emperor's new clothes thing. I think now we're starting to go, well, wait a sec. These people are making so much money. I mean, if they care so much about free, how come 8 people, right? This was in the New York Times, I guess, a few weeks ago. 8 guys are richer than 50% of humanity, and most of them are in the digital space. So I think we're now coming out of that kind of trance that has been created, and seeing that there's tremendous inequality here. And again, because Donald Trump and Le Pen in France and Brexit, we're also getting to see what are the political ramifications when all the wealth ends up in the hands of a tiny percentage of people, and everybody else, and the middle class disappears.
I'm not sure I see the connection to Trump. I do somewhat. I'm not sure I see it as clearly as you. But one thing I wanted to ask is, what effect is that going to have? On the one hand, I think that most people in this room probably didn't vote for Trump, both by political inclination and country of origin. But in the U.S., there's a sense in the creative industries, in the creative class, that, my God, this is the worst thing that ever happened to the country. But maybe I'll be able to make a living again, because since Silicon Valley isn't running the government as much anymore, maybe it is a little. How should we think about that?
Well, but to your point, I mean, the issue with Trump is it's the disdain for, contempt for the state, right?
Right. That's true.
So what I see the issue is between. I do not understand. One of the sort of things I do not understand, although you got to tip your hat to them, is how. To me, Silicon Valley is less a business model and more a political ideology. It's libertarian. It's on the extreme right end of the spectrum. How did those people convince social democracies that are founded on the regulation of their communities, right? I mean, regulations give you universal health care. Regulations pave highways. Regulations are valued in social democracy. They're not valued there, because you want an untrammeled free market. And that's what Trump likes.
One of the things that's interesting is, using the word regulation that much would disqualify you immediately from any kind of political office in the U.S.
Yeah.
That not by my choice, just by sort of the general worldview. I see Silicon Valley as a right word, as a libertarian force, a strong one. but they were also probably closer with the Obama administration than they are with the Trump administration. I'm not sure that makes any sense ideologically.
Well, can I just jump in as someone who's lived in
I'm
both?
sure it doesn't actually, sorry.
But in the States and Canada, and I think a Canadian with my Canadian hat on, and I've lived in Nashville now for 20 years, we have, and we all have our beefs with Canadian regulatory regimes in various areas, but we have a relatively enlightened regulatory regime here in many areas, healthcare. And United States, I have to say, I went down to the States 20 years ago as a Canadian and went, wow, what is this beef with the US government? Because especially in a place like Nashville, boy, you hear about it all the time. And the fact of the matter is I've come to the conclusion that in the United States, regulation is much less enlightened in many areas. Just think about the consent decree, we will not get into that, that has got its foot on the throat of the performing rights societies to the point where their very existence is threatened. So I think there's a different narrative in the States when it comes to regulation and Washington and heavy-handed, and obviously the right wing, those interests that you mentioned use that to maximum benefit for sure.
But I agree with what you said about how does this play, and I wanted to ask Suzanne, you know, you would think it would play in Europe fairly differently, because Silicon Valley is so hostile. You know, Uber didn't wait until the laws were changed as far as taxi cabs. They introduced a product. Airbnb did not deeply research local rent regulations as far as, you know, in terms of compliance. They went ahead and launched. I'm not going to say whether that's bad or good from a business perspective. It's beyond this panel. But it's certainly not the kind of thing you associate with Europe and the European public liking. Does that give us some room for hope that this will be addressed in Europe in a way that will have implications worldwide?
Well, there's an EU directive on it now.
Yes, yes, we try to work on a new directive. It's about 3 years ago, and it's a long way.
Does everyone know what an EU directive does, essentially?
It's a European legislation. So it's a text that is written by the European Commission and the lobbyists too. That's why it's complicated, and so we have to have a digital single market that functions, but the lobby from Google is very powerful. The lobby from the pirates, we have a party pirate, is very powerful, and creators also, but okay. And it's interesting to notice that the European perspective is more libertarian than the national populations are. It's very interesting. There is a paradox.
Yeah.
And yes, exactly. Yeah. And with Juncker, and they are pro-bankers, they are pro no regulations. Actually, they are not for too much regulation and a free market. And but it's interesting also to see how the business models now are based on when the legal framework is empty. Sometimes there is empty spaces in a law, and the business models are based on these empty cases. And because the legislation is far slower than the business model development, the technology world is improving constantly the legal weakness, and then it's powerful. And we have sorry, I'm slow to explain, to find my words, but it's very hard to tax the GAFA, so Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. It's very, very hard, and I don't know if we will be able to do it, to make it one day, but maybe.
One of the real bummers about being a creator is they make you pay taxes where you live instead of in like Liechtenstein. It's a total. It's very upsetting. It's not that much taxes anyway, but even so.
Value gap, though, is mentioned. I think there's a bit of a breakthrough. One of our partner alliances in the Global Alliance of Music Creator Organizations we've been building, EXA, the European Composers and Songwriters Group, has gotten language in the new EU directive on copyright that specifically says we have to talk about reform of value, that talks about the value gap and reform of safe harbor legislation. They use different terminology there, but so that's very, it's very vague, but at least it's on the table for the first time in Europe.
You sort of start just by looking at every single exception that's been created. Like there's dozens of them. Creators aren't going to get paid for this use, not going to get paid for that use, this one, that one, this one, that one. Those are all subsidies, and it's very simple to look at. You can track, I could give you a list of them in Canada right now. And if we just started by rolling back the exceptions, which for 20 years have subsidized what were supposed to be startups, that would make a difference. That alone. And do the same thing in the United States, same thing in the UK.
So let's steer. I think we've got 10 minutes left. Let's go down. I'll start by picking on you because you've been relatively quiet. Give us your reason, something that makes you optimistic and something that makes you pessimistic about how this might be resolved, or not, as the case may be.
No, I'm listening to all this, and I think it's really important. The copyright reform is really important. It takes a long time, and it's a slow process. And just even going through the last copyright bill, it was really, I felt that it was quite ugly how it all ended up rolling out. And I think that in the meantime, what happened was that all of us in the business had to do the deals with all these companies. Like, regardless of what the copyright bill looked like, we couldn't, you can't stop the flow of the technology. What I'm sort of seeing, and this is, I'm thinking specifically about Apple Music, but it's where the rates that we're starting to see out of these companies are actually getting a bit better. And I know that it's sort of like saying, okay, well, we're just getting, we had a small piece and now it's just a little bit bigger. But it seems, the trend seems to be in our ability to negotiate with these companies that we are starting to see better rates. And I think that it's as we go forward and we start understanding that these businesses aren't startups, which we all subsidized at the beginning, but we started seeing things where Apple was starting to pay for the first 3 months, the free tier and all that sort of, that we are moving the needle, but it's too slow, and it's frustrating for us who have to live in this time of transition. But I think that my thing is that while we're all trying to sort out these major issues, and whether it be Trump or whether it be the EU, whatever it is, all of us have to do business at this time. And so I sort of feel that we started out slow and it's getting better. So I'm feeling really optimistic about it.
Eddie?
Yeah, I think that, and I said this to Graham in the hallway yesterday, that I think there's an opportunity here. And that is that although we have internal discussions about how financially things are divided internally in the music business, and sometimes those seem very large and divide us. I think when it comes to safe harbor, extraction of value, value gap, whatever you want to call this issue, we can and should, and I hope we do, stand shoulder to shoulder, because our interests are 100% the same. And I think that, to me, gives me great hope. If we can sit down and not only that, but take it beyond just creative content, but I mean, this affects so many other industries, cultural industries. So I think we have an opportunity here to form a large and very effective, cooperative movement that all speaks with one voice on this issue, and that I think the world is ready for. I do think that there's a zeitgeist. I think that the emperor's new clothes. Everyone has seen the emperor's not wearing any clothes. And I think we have to seize the moment now and move forward together, and that gives me great hope.
Suzanne?
I know that I know nothing. I don't know if I can be optimistic, but the thing I hope is that...
That's a very French answer, and I like that.
Sorry, excuse me.
I like it.
I have to say that I think Google is a very clever machine. It's like shamanism, a very worldwide shamanism, and that exploits our divisions. And music world is all about music, but it's multi little worlds, and we have to discuss together. And it was very interesting to see that a publisher have individual deals and non-disclosure agreements with this big machine. But it's important to have a global discussion as the music sector, as a sector, to be strong, powerful, and able to struggle for our remuneration or for our work. So I'm optimistic in the case of we succeed in to exchange and to be agree between all the stakeholders.
So number one, consumers are using legal platforms. We may object to how we're getting paid by those platforms, but they're using legal platforms. So that is that's something to be optimistic about. There is a legal framework. We just have to work out how it's being shared. Artists are not digital illiterates. They are digital natives, and they've got this nailed, right? So we have reason to be optimistic because young artists, old artists, all of them have got the digital environment figured out. To Eddie's point, they can be as digitally literate as they want, but if we don't all stand together and level this playing field so that when the works that they are putting up into the internet are being appropriately remunerated back, then we'll have failed. But I think that and focus on creators, for those of you who want to check, focusoncreators.ca, go join, sign the letter. That's an example in Canada of us all coming together. So I think those are 3 reasons to be optimistic. But make no mistake about it, we are up against it. Like, this is not going to be an easy struggle. And you and I, Robert, we were just talking about, for example, I read The Guardian all the time. 5 years ago, The Guardian wouldn't have said boo about these issues. And now suddenly they've woken up and you can reliably read, outright vocal criticism of Google and the digital giants in the pages of that. And that's new. And that means it's becoming part of a much larger narrative.
This may make me a self-hating journalist, but when the Guardian thought that being free online was going to lead to a bountiful future for them, they were very positive on a lot of these companies. Now that they saw what a bad strategy that has been, they're very down on these companies. I don't think that's why. Just to be very clear, I don't think that's why. But it's probably not entirely irrelevant. I want to echo something Graham said. One of the things that makes me optimistic is that, we're arguing about we're all arguing in the music business about how to split up money. And that seems like such a drag. Oh, you go to these conferences and people are talking about, percentage splits. It's a little on rock and roll. But, 8 years ago, people were saying, there were panels like, will anyone ever pay for music? Right. Will digital natives ever subscribe to anything? And now you see panels like, who's got my money? Is that a Rihanna song or something like that? You see these very, I'm not getting enough money from such and such. We're fighting over a pie. And which is, I like to get my I'm a journalist. I like to, journalism has its own issues. We're fighting over pie too, but all of a sudden it seems like there's a pie to fight over. It's not who moved my cheese. This is like the worst metaphor ever, I'm sorry. The other thing that makes me optimistic is what's happening in Europe. Right now there's a U.S. process of copyright reform. There's an EU process of copyright reform. I'm pessimistic that the value gap will be addressed in a meaningful way in U.S. legislation. I think it may be addressed in Europe and Canada. I'm not jumping up and down optimistic, but it's certainly cause for optimism. I think we're almost out of time. Does anyone have a question to end with? Why don't you in front, because it's easier for you to just yell.
Sure, okay. The gentleman here was saying that the publishers, after the streaming services had negotiated their rights for the recordings with the labels, the publishers kind of got given what's left. And you're saying it seemed like they were been an afterthought. One of the stats that's been mentioned a couple times here is that there's 80% fewer professional songwriters in Nashville than there was at the height of the industry. And the blame for that seems to be that they're been pushed to the side in the whole royalties regime. It seems that for the labels, in the long run, their health depends on the songwriting community, songwriting profession. How does that split become a little less uneven as far as other than to get all three sides in the same room? Seems unlikely.
Before we address it, I just want to add some context because I think that there's a bunch of issues here. One issue is that the idea of splitting up the pie, sorry, I keep going back to that, between songwriters and performing artists, publishers and labels is not a new issue. So that's an issue that's evolving, but it's not a brand new one. I'll give it to, does anyone else want to address that more specifically?
Yeah, sure. Like we think about this all the time. We look. I sort of see in some ways it's the amount of investment that goes into an artist, a writer, into that career comes from a whole bunch of different places. And I think that it used to be that the label were the primary source for an artist to have to fund their career. And I think that that's changing now. And for me, I wanted the investment that we put into our writers and to our artist writers. I want to be able to see more money coming out of when the royalties start flowing. I want to participate to a larger degree in that case, and we're trying to we're trying to fight for that, but it's a slow process.
I'm gonna have the last word because we're out of time. If it's all right, I want to end with something Graham said. You know, this is a complex issue. I'd be naive if I expected everyone to agree with me. I've heard on Twitter that a lot of people think I'm wrong. But one of the things that Graham said, I think we should all agree on, this is not some kind of technological determinism. The way the internet works, you know, God and Peter Thiel did not sort of sit down and work it out. It's a result of policy decisions by legislators. This is we live in democracies. We can make these decisions. I fully expect we'll disagree. But I think one of the things we should all agree on is let's have our societies and our governments make these decisions. Let's not leave them to a few big companies, because I think we can all agree that that's a terrible idea.
There was a time, I just read recently, I quoted this recently, you know, young people should remember that there was a time when it was okay to say, fuck the man. And right now, the man is Google. And I shouldn't just say it's just them, but, you know, it's GAFA or whatever it is, and you do get to stand up to them.
Yeah, but they have the resources they have. I think, as you said, Graham, let's not underestimate the challenge here. The resources are formidable, to say the least. And governments know that.
We're going well into wrap now. You know, we get these angry signs in black and white. We run out of time. So I want to thank my panelists and thank you for coming to a panel that I hope is very interesting.
Thanks.